Is this all that you dreamed it'd be? Ending up here, ending up with me.
In today's video, I'd like to briefly talk about how Trump once again referenced his so-called sacred number and on how he seems to focus in on two specific numbers over and over again. In an interview last week on One America News, Trump talked about how the crowd at his January 6th speech, the day of the attack on the Capitol, was much, much larger than the estimates of 10,000 people by the mainstream media. Here's a brief clip.
They never show helicopter pictures of that incredible crowd because it was the largest crowd I've ever spoken before. I've never had a crowd. I've never seen a crowd that big.
It was massive.
It was the real number. I won't say because it'll be a headline. Oh, he exaggerated the number. The real number was over that sacred number. Okay,
yeah.
You know what that number was, right?
I do.
And I don't even talk about that.
So in that clip, Trump stated that the crowd size was not only much more than 10,000, but it was close to that sacred number. He didn't specifically say what that number would be, but told the woman interviewing him that she knew exactly what it was, and she nodded yes. It's actually pretty easy to discover what that sacred number is, as Trump himself told us what it was. Here is Trump, about 3 weeks after he lost the election, in a press conference that didn't even last 1 minute, telling us about the so-called sacred number.
The stock market's just broken 30,000. Never been broken, that number. That's a sacred number, 30,000. Nobody thought they'd ever see it.
So putting Trump's previous statement about the stock market together with his interview last week on OAN, Trump is clearly stating that not only were there more than 10,000 people at his January 6, 2020 speech, but that the number was likely about 30,000, or 3 times what the estimates of the crowd size were at the time. Of course, it's not surprising in the least that Trump would claim such a crowd size, especially if we remember that his people also claimed that his inauguration crowd was the biggest of all time. But let me tell you a curious thing about the sacred number of 30,000. As we know, Trump is already marketing the number 45 as a representation of his name, a fact that I previously talked about a few months back in a video. New websites and social networks are also springing up, utilizing the number 45 in their names, with one of the more recent examples being One America News and their own Free Talk 45. Here's the curious thing, and some of you undoubtedly already know this. Look what happens when we take Trump's so-called sacred number of 30,000 and divide it by Trump's other favorite number, 45. That's an interesting result, isn't it? Or we could do it the other way and take Trump's sacred number of 30,000 and divide it by 666. It's certainly kind of odd that when we take the number 666 and divide it into 30,000, the number that Trump calls sacred, the result is the number 45, which points right back at Trump. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is anything biblical, but it is extraordinarily odd that the two numbers that seem to mean the most to Trump, 45 and 30,000, also have a connection to the number 666. It should be interesting to see if, over the coming months and years, Trump makes another reference to his sacred number of 30,000, or if indeed the number 30,000 ends up being used in some other way during these end times. Time will tell on that one. The other item I wanted to mention is that I recently saw the absolutely perfect cartoon depiction of Trump, and it even has a biblical connotation as well. I'll show that to you in a second, but first, here are 2 others that merit discussion. This first cartoon is showing 2 men wishing each other happy Hang Mike Pence Day, which is sadly accurate about how too many Americans viewed the 1-year anniversary of the attack on the Capitol. There's also this older cartoon, which I've shown before, of Trump standing next to the cross and referring to it as a big, beautiful T for Trump, while evangelicals look on and proclaim how devout Trump is. While this cartoon is humorous, I've talked about in other videos that I don't think it's any small coincidence that the man who matches the biblical description of the Antichrist also just happens to use a symbol that is almost identical to the Christian cross. But now let me show you what I think is the perfect cartoon of Trump, which I saw a week or so back. In this drawing, Trump is pictured as a giant snake having just swallowed the GOP. He is being asked how he would describe the party and responds with delicious. This cartoon perfectly depicts exactly what has happened over the past few years, as Trump has completely devoured the GOP. It is not only a completely different party from Reagan's GOP, it's completely different from even the GOP of 6 or 7 years ago. Today's GOP refers to any Republican who is not completely loyal to Trump as a rhino, or un-American, or even treasonous. But while the term rhino is most often used to call out other Republicans, ironically, it's the GOP name itself that is the actual rhino. The name GOP is now a misnomer, as the Republican Party is 100% the Trump Party. There is simply nothing left that has not been swallowed up by Trump and his agenda. It wouldn't even surprise me if the GOP moniker itself eventually goes by the wayside, replaced by a new name that specifically references Trump. The other aspect of this cartoon showing Trump as a devouring snake is interesting from a biblical perspective, because the Bible specifically describes the final Antichrist as a dreadful and terrible beast, exceedingly strong, that devours and breaks everything into pieces. Trump has even bragged about destroying the careers of those Republicans who criticize him, and he's exactly right. Simply put, Trump leaves a trail of destruction in his path. The image of Trump as a devouring snake is absolutely spot on in so many ways, and it's always been curious to me how much glee Trump took in reciting the snake poem. Listen again as he recites it with joy. It's almost like he's talking about himself.
On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Poor thing," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you." She wrapped him up all cozy in a comforter of silk and laid him by her fireside with some honey and some milk. She hurried home from work that night, and as soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. She clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, oh heavens, you would have died." She stroked his pretty skin again and kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite. "I have saved you," cried the woman, "and you've bitten me, heavens, why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die." "Oh, shut up, silly woman," said the reptile with a grin. "You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in."